Everyone. Hi, good morning, afternoon, evening, wherever you might be. Thank you for joining today's webinar, The Path Forward, Targeting Key Sourcing Areas to Reduce Supply Chain Risk. My name is Karen Mo, and I lead nature research and partnerships with the Food and Forest team here at Ceres. We are a nonprofit organization working with influential capital market leaders to solve the world's greatest sustainability challenges. And I want to go over a few logistics just before we start. So please note that this session is being recorded. We will be providing all participants with a link to the recording shortly after this webinar. We will have a time for audience Q&A later on the agenda. So if you have any questions during the webinar, please enter them in the question and answer box in the bottom right-hand corner. And if you need a closed captioning, you can select that option on the Zoom toolbar as well. And if you need assistance with audio or other technical issues, please let us know in the chat box. As we are discussing corporate performance today, I need to provide you with this disclaimer. I'll leave it here for a minute for those who want to read in details, but to capture the key points, the series does not require or seek collective decision-making or action with respect to acquiring, holding, disposing, or voting securities. Series facilitates the exchange of public information, but participants must not share or exchange non-public, competitively sensitive information, and all decisions by investor participants are at their sole discretion and made in their individual capacities. Ceres and its investor networks do not act or speak on behalf of each other or other investors, nor do we provide investment or proxy voting recommendations. As we discuss ways to address the threats to forest and nature, I would also like to share this slide to respectfully acknowledge the ancestral and unceded territories of all Native and Indigenous peoples in the US and globally, as well as the role that they played for centuries and millennia in stewarding their lands. This acknowledgement is a form of a commitment to recognize and respect the rights of Indigenous peoples around the world, including through our own work. On today's webinar, we will explore how corporate investment in sourcing landscapes can complement traditional due diligence processes to help companies manage risks and generate multitude benefits. We will also discuss the role that well-designed landscape initiatives can play in corporate strategy. We are joined by fantastic investor and company panelists for a deep dive discussion later on. But first, I want to level set everyone's understanding of some of the key concepts with the highlights from Ceres' new report, Working Across Landscapes, an Investor Guide to Managing Nature Risk at Scale. The central premise of our conversation today is the recognition that many food and agriculture companies and their investors are already familiar with the business risks tied to deforestation and natural ecosystem conversion. Companies that have traditionally managed these risks through risk assessments and various due diligence systems for tracking and monitoring their commodity sourcing. While we've seen increase in uptake in corporate due diligence efforts, and we definitely need more of these, but we are also realizing that it's insufficient to end deforestation and its broader consequences as we continue to lose 11 soccer fields worth of forest every minute. And at the same time, we are seeing an increasing interest among the investors in how food and agriculture companies and forestry companies are managing risks beyond deforestation. Flooding, fire, diseases, and land conflicts. A lot of these are also tied to our climate and nature related challenges are now just some of the examples of environmental and social risks in commodity supply chains that are beyond the control of individual companies. There is a need for companies to adopt risk management approaches that can address these broader risks that are hard to really manage through their own operations and supply chains. And luckily, we don't have to reinvent the wheel to come up with solutions because many collaborative multi-stakeholder programs have been developed as platforms for companies to work with the local partners to address interconnected nature, climate, and social issues across a wide range of issues and larger geography. For the sake of brevity and convenience, we will use the term landscape initiatives to describe all these programs. And according to the 2024 CDP questionnaire data, these initiatives are far from niche. They are widely adopted. And approximately half of the companies that report to CDP are investing in one way or another some of these initiatives. And some of these investments are quite sizable. And more importantly, these initiatives cover approximately 20% of the commodity disclosure volumes on average. So the challenge for those of us who analyze corporate sustainability performance is twofold. On the one hand, we need to understand the motive or the business case for corporate participation. And on the other hand, we need to know that the companies are making investments in the right place and delivering the impact that they claim. So our report dives into both aspects with a lot of company case studies, and you will hear more from our panelists shortly. But let me just briefly summarize our key findings. When we looked at why company invest in these landscape initiatives and what matters to investors, there are 5 categories of benefits that stood out. First is the risk mitigation. And I have already mentioned that many of the environmental and social risks that surround commodity supply chains cannot be easily managed by individual companies on their own. Landscape initiatives provide a means for companies to expand their risk mitigation efforts across whole areas of production, including areas of potential future sourcing. So, for example, in our report, we highlight how Nestle is investing in a landscape initiative in Malaysia to help prevent palm oil linked to deforestation from entering its supply chain. And landscape initiatives can also increase supply chain resilience by protecting or restoring ecosystems that buffer climate impacts and by helping producers adapt to changing conditions in key sourcing regions. One clearest example that we've seen is in the coffee and cocoa supply chains, which have been heavily impacted by climate change and then changing growing conditions in recent years. Companies like JDEP, which is one of the largest coffee companies, are investing multi-year landscape initiatives within key coffee producing regions to increase farm productivity, promoting climate resilient agricultural practices, and expanding access for farmers to agricultural inputs and finance. And all of these help ensure a more resilient and long-term supply base for the company. And one crucial advantage for companies to invest in landscape initiatives as opposed to running its own projects is the benefit to be able to share costs and leverage additional support from government, philanthropic organizations, financial institutions, civil society organizations, and so on. These partner organizations can also provide technical support for mapping and monitoring suppliers and tracing commodities for the companies to reduce costs. So in one case study that we looked at, it was found that the shared data system can lower the cost of compliance with the European Union's deforestation regulation to a third of what is required for companies to individually monitor supply chains on a farm-by-farm basis. And in a similar manner, collective monitoring and reporting frameworks can help companies get the data they need to report against a growing body of disclosure and target setting frameworks, regulations, and standards such as the TNFD and the Task Force for Nature-related Financial Disclosures, UCSRD, and many others. And last but not least, maintaining a social license to operate is also an important consideration. Landscape initiatives can help companies prioritize the rights and the needs of producers and communities at the base of their supply chains, which helps to reduce their exposure to conflicts and reputational risk. So while there's a strong business case we found for companies to join the landscape initiatives, not all participation is strategic and material to the company's core business. So it's important for investors to understand how a company's involvement in landscape initiative supports its business strategy and they're delivering the positive impact on the ground. And conversely, if the companies are not currently involved in an initiative, investors would also need to understand if it's a relevant strategy for that particular company. So for that reason, um, we in our report outline some of the key engagement considerations for investors, and these are broken down into two categories. So the first is relates to the materiality. So the landscape initiative should be material to a company's business. And one of the criteria for this is around how these investments are tied to the company's high risk sourcing regions or commodities that they depend on. And company needs to be able to actually demonstrate that linkage. And another consideration on the materiality front is that landscape initiatives are more likely to be material for the company when their supply chain exhibits certain characteristics. For example, the company might source a large volume of a certain commodity, or their supply chain may be quite interconnected and it's difficult for them to switch suppliers. And they might be sourcing commodity from a very specific location, such as regional coffee that you cannot easily source from elsewhere. And also, if there are a large number of smallholders in the company's supply chain, it would also make case over make a business case for the company to invest in these locations. And lastly, if a company is sourcing, multiple commodities from the same region, it's often make the business case for them to invest in these locations. And in addition to these sort of materiality considerations, the landscape initiative should also, be able to demonstrate that the these initiatives are credible and they will have the intended impact. So the term maturity is used to define a set of core criteria that can give companies and investors a greater confidence that these initiatives will deliver the stated goals. So these may include the size of the initiative, which should encompass an area large enough to shape the underlying conditions in sourcing regions, the governance structure, which should facilitate meaningful participation from key stakeholders, including local governments and indigenous and local communities. And these initiatives should also have a collective goals and actions that are developed through a participatory planning processes and also collective monitoring frameworks that allow for verifying and transparently reporting progress. So there are a lot of details that we provide in our report that you can download from the link that we will have on the screen. And before I turn to the panel discussion, I just want to make one final point, and that is, why Series is now releasing this work to the investor communities. And some of you on this webinar may be familiar with a headline statistic published by the UN earlier this year, which states that $4.9 trillion of private finance is flowing into economic activities with a direct negative impact on nature on an annual basis, whereas private investment in nature-based solutions and nature-positive outcomes is negligible by comparison. So, to address these nature finance gaps, we really need companies to do not only reduce their negative impact, like reducing deforestation from their supply chains, but also invest in the value chain that can deliver positive outcomes, both for the business, for the local communities, and for the climate and nature more broadly. And they are able to do so credibly and with the full accountability. And we think that investing in well-designed and implemented landscape initiatives is a compelling strategy for companies, investors, and an investor can really play in a role in guiding companies in this area. So with that, I will now turn over to my colleague Alan Pierce to dive into some of the real world eh, conversation with our panelists.
Great. Thanks so much, Karen. Hi, everyone. My name is Alan Pierce. I'm a Director of Engagement Strategies on the Food and Forest team at Ceres. The Food and Forest team, we cover a lot of things related to these sectors or activities related to food and forests, and in particular, have a heavy emphasis on climate and deforestation and nature and biodiversity loss. Topics that are very interconnected when we're talking about landscape scale initiatives. And so, as you know, we're bringing this topic forward, and as Karen noted, this is something that we see a lot of potential for increased investment and activity from companies and investors to try to address some of the interconnected risks associated that emerge at a landscape level. And so really pleased to be joined today by some fantastic perspectives here. I'll give a quick intro of who we're going to be hearing from. First, Simon Hall is a director at the Walmart Foundation, where he leads philanthropic strategy and supports corporate sustainability priorities that integrate forests, nature, climate, and people. And before joining Walmart, Simon worked at the National Wildlife Federation for 8 years, where he helped to lead their efforts to address tropical deforestation. So we'll be able to present sort of a perspective from the retailer side of things. Then we're also joined by Michelle Santos from Bunge, presenting a perspective from a different stage in the value chain. Michelle has more than 25 years of experience in sustainability, corporate affairs, and marketing, and is a senior director of global sustainability at Bunge, who's a global agribusiness leader. Michelle supports the company's long-term sustainability vision, development of strategies and operating principles, and engages with business leaders and sustainability teams to drive implementation of global ESG goals and priorities. And Frederick Bach is our third speaker from Ocm, who's a Paris-based asset manager. He joined in 2021 as head of ESG and CSR, and in his role, he oversees the integration of sustainability considerations into the investment products offered by the firm. And Frederick also runs proprietary engagement programs and proxy voting at ASEAN. Okay, so to help manage things here, I'm going to start with Michelle because I know he is going to have to leave a little bit early. So I want to make sure we get some perspectives to start with there. So Michelle, I know we've worked on this for quite some time, but Bunge has really been committed to achieving zero deforestation and conversion, and has demonstrated a lot of progress over the years through traceability and then on the ground monitoring, reporting, and verification work. Um, can you tell us, though, a little bit more about how the company determines when and where a landscape investment or a landscape scale initiative is the right strategy for managing sourcing risks?
Sure. Can you hear me?
Yes. Yeah, sounds
Yeah.
good.
Yeah. So thanks again for inviting us for this quite important discussion, and I congratulate Ceres for the very interesting report as well. So yeah, as you were saying, we are quite engaged with our commitments, and our commitment is to be deforestation free in 2025. We are happy to say that we achieved the goal of monitoring a very, very large area. We are talking about landscapes. We are talking about over 57 million hectares of farmland being monitored. That's roughly the size of France, continental France, for you to have an idea, or the whole UK and Germany together. This is all about farmland. This is what we are doing. And that means full traceability to our direct and indirect sources in areas of priority for South America, which encompasses Brazil, Paraguay, and Argentina. So it's been a journey, a 10 years journey. And we noticed that we would need to go beyond our own traceability, our own direct sourcing. So we had to engage our indirect sourcing as well. So we started this kind of a landscape approach when we were engaging our resellers into that. Today, over 140 different resellers are part of this kind of initiatives, which we call sustainable partnership initiatives. Uh, I would say that we work in landscape level initiatives because the most important thing in terms of sustainability are the challenges in agriculture, and that requires broad action and scalable solutions. So in soy, for example, the challenge is not just our own supply, as I mentioned. It's not only about our own traceability, but it's also about helping to decouple agricultural growth from negative impacts that affect ecosystems resilience. So if we want to understand better about a full landscape, because that's where we are sourcing from, that's the whole supply chain, we have to work in a collaborative way. It's also about helping, the others to be part of it. So it's not only about the farm fences, but also about the neighbors of these farms. Otherwise, we're going to be creating isolated islands of prosperity amid an unsustainable landscape, and this is not our intention. We need actions to be effective overall. Nature goes beyond the single farm. These initiatives allow Bunge and other stakeholders to work with farmers at scale. So this is what we want. It's about technical assistance, about financial incentives, it's about tailored solutions locally that would support sustainable production while helping preserve local biodiversity and global carbon emissions, which is also part of our strategy. From the business standpoint, the approach helps us to address several connected challenges. So it supports long-term access to responsibly sourced commodities, helps meet evolving customers and regulatory expectations, and also reduce land use change and climate risk in the supply base. That is helping us with sustainable production, economically viable for the farmers. And this is so important to have farmer-centric policies for Bunge that is directly linked to our supply chain resilience. So it's all about our business to be, monitoring a larger area, engaging a larger area. Market access, because you've seen so many of the regulation coming through. So we have to deliver on this market access and also progress against our own commitments for climate and non-deforestation. I would say that these are the most important things that we have. Is not only about what we do in South America. Definitely, we are also working with palm mainly, which is another critical crop for us in terms of fighting deforestation. So we have partnerships in Southeast Asia. So we are empowering smallholders in Southeast Asia. More than 1,000 independent smallholders are now adopting sustainable palm oil best practices. This is a collaborative effort with Mass, for instance, and we are training people. We are developing the best that we can deliver. So it's about creating an ecosystem that is sustainable and that would help us to meet not only our targets, but will help to get proper resilience in the whole world that we are suffering from.
Great. So it's really interesting to hear how you describe the need for resilience and by working kind of a little bit more holistically beyond just your direct and indirect sourcing relationships to think about the need for resilience and a little bit more holistic basis. But maybe to follow up, could we look at a specific example to try to, help folks understand a little bit more practical level? I know that Bunge just published its latest report, and there's quite a few examples, some related to palm, some related to shea, some related to soy as well. I know one we've noted has been published for several years is the WBCSD Farmers First Clusters program. I don't know if there's one that stands out to you. You could speak to a little bit about like how you chose that program and what benefits you've seen from being involved in that program.
The Farmer First Cluster was a great example of things that we could not do alone. So we needed a lab to understand better what kind of solutions could be in place. So the progress is just great in terms of the Farmers First Cluster. We have over 260 farms which are part of the program. They were part of the program by end in 2025. It's more than 1.4 million hectares of farmland cover, 300,000 hectares of native vegetation. And what I do like the most is about the surplus of legal reserve. In Brazil, farmers are asked to keep some set-aside areas as their legal reserve. We have 46,000 of extra legal reserve in these areas. These are things that Bunge cannot do alone. So this type of progress is just supporting a broader business strategy in several ways, right? It reinforces our non-deforestation commitment. So this is what it's a basic for the business. It's supporting the production models that reduce pressure on native vegetation. Our commitment is not only about deforestation, but about also converting native vegetation. So it contributes to our climate goals because it helps to address land use change. And the emissions from the land use change is what is hitting us the most. We are happy to say that in terms of science-based targets, which we do have, our scope 3, is almost there already. We are almost there delivering all the goals for the scope 3, and this is still 2025 report. We have 5 years to come. And the integration with Iterra has provided us more expertise, more areas, and more things more food for thought for us to deliver in these terms, but it's getting in there. It also supports biodiversity. And biodiversity is the second main concern on everybody's head. That's the wealth report, right? If you think about medium long term. So having proper care with biodiversity and addressing nature outcomes, it's the best thing that we can do because we are preserving the native vegetation in priority biomes. We are keeping the biodiversity. We are enhancing how these crops could grow and keeping the resilience that all these areas could have. Moreover, it also helps us in terms of test solutions, as I mentioned in the beginning. So not all the portfolio would remain for the future, but at least we know what could go wrong, when to engage the farmer, and how to also ask support from other parties, investors, and other players. That's the reason why we are also now working under the Forest Positive Coalition, together with the Consumer Goods Forum, under the Soft Commodities Forum. So we are part of the World Economic Forum, but WBCSD has the Soft Commodities Forum. We are joining now together with the CGF Consumer Goods Forum into the Forest Positive Coalition, and that's just embracing more area, more solutions. So that's why it's so good working together, and we can identify scalable solutions with full integration of priorities, not only ours, but also the whole value chain. So that's expanding a little bit more. We believe that this is the way going forward. We believe that there are things that we do alone, and that's very important to the resilience, specifically on our supply chain. But once you are talking about landscapes, you have to engage others and bring others to the game. The benefit is for all, and that's what we want. Share benefit, not only for our supply, but also for farmers and our main customers that are working with us into that.
Great. Thanks. That really insightful and helpful. There's a couple points I want to follow up on, and we may have to get your thoughts in chat if we can. But in particular, a couple things stood out. One is scale, and one is about outcomes. So maybe we can come back to those questions. But I want to bring in maybe Simon next. To get a little bit of Walmart's approach here. So Simon, I know Walmart published this year its Sustainable Commodities Report that lists many different place-based initiatives that the company supports and is involved in. And of course, many of these would be categorized as landscape initiatives. With Walmart being such a major global company with supply chains around the world, can you give a brief overview of that project portfolio, the landscape initiative portfolio, and what were some of the internal criteria or processes that Walmart applies to be able to identify initiatives that are strategic and material to the business?
Yeah, thanks. A couple questions in there, so I'll try to work through them. So to start with, Walmart has an ambition to become a regenerative company. And so we really sort of kicked that off about 5 years ago in 2020 or so. And there's sort of multiple facets of that. So we kind of take a very holistic approach. So there's a lot of work on climate, scope 1, 2, 3. There's people, farmers, communities, associates, livelihoods, all of that work. There's waste, circularity. There is nature, of course. And so that's sort of the larger backdrop. Zooming in a little bit on sort of the nature, similar to what we heard from Michelle and Muggy, we also have a forest policy set that are aspirations and expectations for suppliers around deforestation, conversion, free sourcing. We also have a nature goal, an explicit commitment to help protect, restore, more sustainably manage 50 million acres of land, 1 million square miles of ocean. So there's sort of the backdrop of like the larger ambition, very specific sort of policies and commitments that we've made publicly. And so like how do we then execute against those things? So the way that we think about things is sort of in a continuous improvement framework. So we have sort of a good, better, best kind of way of thinking about things and trying to sort of move suppliers up that maturity curve. So a lot of the practice adoption, certification, DCF verification sort of elements, live in a combination of good and better, depending upon how many things are sort of working together. Landscape and jurisdictional approaches, or what we sort of generally refer to internally as place-based initiatives, as we sort of span both land and sea, are best. So that is what we see as best in class in terms of ability to deliver outcomes. And this is a both and situation. So a lot of the work that we're doing in that portfolio that you reference is building on a foundation of supply chain. It's building on a foundation of verification. It's building on a foundation of certified sourcing. And then we're layering in additional elements into that really sort of take it to that next level and make it sort of best in class. And I'm happy to talk through a little bit more about what that looks like in practice. So in the report that you probably saw, we'll have another one coming out soon, sort of maybe in a little bit later this year. I think we have like over 30 kind of landscape and seascape initiatives. This spans forest, which is sort of more my area. It spans grasslands and it spans oceans. So it's sort of covering a real sort of both breadth of work and depth of activities and impacts. Um, you asked about how we sort of navigate that. How do we make decisions? We have a few sort of frameworks that we use, and I'll sort of talk about them just really briefly. So the first is we start with business relevance. Like, is this a commodity that's relevant for a business that's in our supply chain? Two, do we feel that if we were to make investments or take some action, we could actually drive a meaningful positive impact for people and planet? And then three, would those actions build trust and credibility with stakeholders, both on the ground and with our investors and within our sort of associates and broader ecosystem of stakeholders? So that's sort of like the first main filter. Like, you even get through that. If you get through all of those, then we sort of look at the second cut of that as like, well, why would you do a place-based initial or a landscape or seascape kind of approach? Some of the things that we would sort of ask ourselves would be things like, well, are the challenges truly systemic in the sense that they're intertwined and can't really be addressed by like a certification or sort of other sort of supply chain intervention? Two, are the risks geographically concentrated in a specific landscape where that approach really makes sense? Or do we need to work like across everywhere in the supply chain? And some of these are like both and situations. And then the third question we ask ourselves is like, can we solve it ourselves? I think Michelle spoke a little bit about to that as well. It's like, so if the answer to those is like, yes, there's systemic challenges, yes, there's geographically concentrated risk, and yes, we need others to work together to really solve this, we then have the candidate for potentially a good sort of candidate for a landscape or jurisdictional approach. And then there's a lot of other sort of design factors and work, and whether we sort of lead with the business and lead into our business strengths with our suppliers, or we complement that through the use of philanthropy. There's different sort of levers we can pull on that, but hopefully that sets out like the framework and sort of grounding of how we approach all of this.
Yeah, that's super helpful. Thanks, Simon. So to follow up, of course, things are going to vary by place and by commodity. What is and that makes it a little bit challenging, I imagine, just from a resource standpoint internally to have the expertise, have somebody who's knowledgeable about, seafood, supply chains, specific species of fish in certain parts of the ocean compared to somebody who's got knowledge on agricultural landscapes in North America, South America, Southeast Asia, et cetera. How does how do you sort of determine internally where to prioritize? Is there anything any guidance you can give around the how you try to allocate based on the sheer number of commodities and regions that you're sourcing from? Or is it just, as you were describing a little bit more, if it can meet those filters, is that kind of the determining factors?
Well, we have over 2 million associates across the company, so we have a deep bench of great people and lots of subject matter expertise in-house across both whether it's the foundation, sustainability team, merchants. So everything is really embedded in what we're doing. I'd say like we have worked with so many NGO partners, external consultants, the collaborative networks, whether it's Consumer Goods Forum or the WBCSD groups and many others. And so we do a lot of deep listening. We really sort of take care in trying to understand what's the data and the science telling us, which commodities have outsized impact in different ways across different dimensions, whether it's climate, nature, people, et cetera. And so that helps with some of that sort of prioritization and filtering that I mentioned. So we know, like for example, when on deforestation, there are certain commodities that have outsized impact on forests and ecosystems. And some of those are really well established and generally known. And then we can even just sort of take that a click down into the details of what that means for our supply chain. So there is very much sort of the science-based, data-driven, combined with like deep stakeholder listening that helps inform how we do that prioritization exercise.
Great. Yeah, that's really helpful. So I want to bring Frederick in here next. More from the investor asset management perspective, I see we've got one question so far come in. So folks, if you do have questions, please put them in the Q&A feature. But Frederick, we can weave maybe the answer to that in here in just a second. But one of the premises that we've been talking about is there are risks that cannot be managed by individual companies, individual actors, and that landscape scale initiatives can help address that through multi-stakeholder, multi-collaborative efforts. Um, Curious for your thoughts on that. What kind of risks or challenges have you seen that you think could benefit from more of this broader scale approach?
Yeah, hello. Thank you for having me and giving me the opportunity to share what I've learned from my experience in running engagement programs, both here and in previous companies. Um, when you when you engage with a company or when you engage on a topic, you try to do your homework and try to understand what the issues are. So here we're talking about deforestation or climate change or extreme weather events, how they can have an impact on the company's business. We have Michelle who's trying to source commodities around the world, and Simon whose company is trying to source food product mostly, but not just around the world. How can these events disrupt their supply chain? And we as an investor, we think, oh, well, maybe if they just do this or just do that, then they'll be safe. That'll be okay. If you just source from non-deforested areas, then you'll be fine. But it's never that simple. And once you start talking with the companies, you realize how complex the issue is. And if we take, I think Michelle mentioned palm oil, um, which is um, uh, which is everybody's favorite villain in terms of commodities because of deforestation in Southeast Asia. Um, I think the real issue, there are many intertwined issues, and that's always for me the key concept to keep in mind is that there's never a simple problem. There's one problem that is linked to another problem that is then interconnected, and both are interconnected to a third problem. And so climate change is one, deforestation is one, people trying to make a living is one, companies trying to source products at good cost is one, etc., etc., etc. And you have to keep in mind all these considerations to understand what the companies are doing and how they're trying to do the best they can for themselves and their shareholders, but also for the investors. And as you know, if you try to please everyone, you end up not pleasing anybody. And so for example, I'm sorry, I'm sort of divagating, but coming back to palm oil, the one of the main issues is that there is a huge amount, an incomparable number of small producers that then sell to mid-sailors who sell to wholesalers, and you as a company, if you purchase the palm oil, it's almost impossible to know exactly or to pinpoint exactly where this particular palm oil was produced because it's an aggregate of an aggregate of an aggregate. And as a company, it's just impossible to guarantee or to have some form of comfort that it's not a significant fraction has been produced on deforested land. So, and this is why when we started the discussion before today about these landscape initiatives, immediately I could tell the benefit that companies and I think that is the case. It's been mentioned. I could tell the benefit that companies could gain from relying on a sort of a on-the-ground network, organizational network that could provide this guarantee by being on the ground in touch with all those small suppliers and sort of leveraging the effort because company A, Bungie or Walmart have an interest, but company B, without naming names, and dozens of other companies have the same interest, and rather than replicating these efforts, mutualizing them, is a cost benefit for everyone, and that's the first thing that I saw in this. So the cost element, and again, we can talk about how cost comes into consideration versus sustainability, and that's not just for me as an investor, but it's also for my clients. They most of them want to invest in companies that do well in terms of sustainability, that don't pollute too much, that are working on their emissions, that are controlling their supply chain, etc. So for me as an investor, for my clients as asset owners, but also for the companies like the ones that are represented here today, there is always the monetary conservation. We should never forget that, and we don't. Apart maybe from people like yourselves, Alan, uh, we don't aim for sustainability for the sake of it. And I think one element that we need to keep in mind is that sustainability is a good thing because it's material, and if you invest in sustainable companies that do efforts, then there will be financial materiality that will materialize in the long run in the price of those companies if they do good. But we should never forget that. But again, those companies, they want to do good, I think. They also want to make sure that, sustainability efforts are not disproportionate with, what they're able to spend. They have margins, they have costs, employees, etc. I think in your report, you say, the costs can be reduced by two-thirds, by mutualizing these efforts. Any company, whether they spend a lot in terms of efforts and money to make sure that their activities is more sustainable, or whether they spend a little because they're not sure if it's really worth it. All companies will be interested in reducing those costs. And then there was, I don't know, I can take the question that was asked,
Yeah.
there is the spend, and again, I talk to companies, I talk to IR people, I talk to sustainability groups or offices inside companies, and there's a huge amount. I mean, these are large companies, obviously, they can afford to have, a 20 or 30 or 50 person team that looks at sustainability, but there's a cost. Um, I think all these companies will be happy to be able to do better because it's philosophically interesting to them, but also because it's financially material to them. And any initiative such as those will garner attention. Now, is this CSR or is this financially material? It is indeed a bit of both, but I think in the long run, it's just good business. It's investment in your approach. It's, in the same way you want to improve your machines, you want to improve your distribution network. Investing in sustainability, I think companies are slowly starting to realize is a good financial investment for the long term because it will deliver its rewards on top of creating a good image and on top of having a sustainable, beneficial to the planet business.
Great. Thanks, Frederick. And thanks for starting to address that one of the first questions that came in there on in the Q&A. Um, so maybe following up or turning back to Simon, there was another question that came in, sort of thinking about the cost benefit analysis. Is the benefit of having a broad global supply chain, does that outweigh that of having a more concentrated supply chain in a given region? Um, And maybe you could, I don't know if you could touch on that as well as maybe any thoughts you have on this other question that's come in about how to make this how these investments are budgeted. Are they part of a philanthropy budget? Are they part of a CSR budget? Are they kind of core to sourcing or an operational budget? I'm curious for your takes on those questions.
Yes, those are all great questions. I'm happy
I
to
keep
to
giving
take.
you I keep giving you multiple questions at once.
This is great. Just keep them coming. We're have a lot of experience in this, so I'm happy to share some of our insights. So first off, I'll just say like we want the sustainable choice to be the everyday choice customers. So your everyday low price retailer, like meat cost is an essential sort of part of the equation there. We're not trying to sort of solve for niche markets. We're trying to solve for everyone. We want this to be as inclusive as possible. So it is an important consideration. How do we pay for these things? And I think investing in sustainability is a no-brainer in 2026. The question is like, why invest in this specific type of management model? And that might be a sort of a topic for deeper sort of reflection that we can sort of get into and unpack a little further if we have time. But let me sort of directly answer the question. So how do you fund these things? They are primarily funded through three buckets of money. They are funded through philanthropy. This is general. This is like applies to everyone. We work with a lot of different stakeholders. People fund them philanthropically. So we do that. I do that through a foundation. We make grants. It's a great way to fund things and build capacity and create enabling conditions for success. So you can fund it philanthropically. You can fund it through sustainability. We don't really do CSR. Everything for us is embedded in the business. So if there's a shared value investment sort of lens that we put on everything, and I ran through some of that already. So we don't do like sort of one-off like pet project type of thing. So, but there is a sustainability budget that you can draw from. Um, and the third bucket, which I think there's some of the comments are sort of alluding to, which is the much larger, much more interesting and more meaningful, is called cost of goods sold or COGS. And so that is where sort of procurement and sourcing sort of embed into their spec that they're buying the cost of any additional sort of interventions that go on top of certified or whatever you need to do to make that happen. So we have examples across our 30 plus initiatives that span the full gamut of where we've deployed philanthropically, where we've deployed from a sustainability budget, and increasingly as we're moving and maturing this work, how that sort of shows up in cost of goods. Each one have their own sort of pros and cons. But I think that there's much, at least I can speak for us, the supply chain and the amount of money that flows through that is orders of magnitude larger than what we can do philanthropically and or through a annual sort of sustainability budget. Um, so that's hopefully answers those questions. The one around like it's a great question on like cost benefit. I love that as an economist. Like where like how do you do it's a classic sort of issue around like do you sort of spread it out and hedge your bets and have a lot of a deep bench of sort of sourcing areas, or do you go really deep in a few places and like build out resilience in that place? I would sort of just say it's a false choice to put them as an either or. It's an and you need both, and you just need to be really thoughtful about where you do those things. So a good example like um is cocoa, for example, and for all of the chocolate supply. So like there are specific origins that like if they fail, we all fail. And so it's like Ghana, Cote d'Ivoire, and Ecuador. If those three origins are not viable, there's a massive problem for everyone. Are those the only places that produce cocoa? No. So there is sort of a diversity of production origins across the world, but there's also like a very specific places that a depth of intervention is super important. So this is both depth and breadth, and you can kind of think of that as sort of the horizontal and vertical and how you would approach that. It really just comes down to individual companies sort of, navigating that and making some of those trade-offs and having those conversations internally. But we very much see it as a both and. You have to sort of pick and choose where you do that. And true surety of supply and true resilience is a combination of both. You can't just be sort of like completely dependent upon one origin, even if you're going really deep there. Do you really need to sort of have both the breadth and depth working together for you?
Great. Yeah, thanks so much. I think really helpful ways to answer some of the questions we've seen come in so far. Um, Michelle, I kind of want to come back to you with one last question if we can. I see you're able to come back on camera. If you need to drop or jump, that's fine too. I mentioned earlier I was curious to come back on the questions of scale and outcomes. You mentioned, being involved in now the Consumer Goods Forum Forest Positive Coalition and other activities like that are important ways to help scale. Um, but I'm curious, as things scale, as as your company gets more involved in some of these collaborative initiatives and landscape scale initiatives, how do you expect the outcomes will scale? I know it's that's one of the questions we hear a lot from investors is how do we evaluate kind of the overall credibility of these initiatives and what's the sort of data output that might be able to expect from that? And I just curious how you might speak to that beyond the participation. Is there another way you could characterize this sort of the outcomes that the business sees from its participation in the initiatives?
Yeah, thanks. Well, I hope I have time to answer that. It's a very, very long answer that I could provide. I would say that the most important thing is the collaboration, right? So for companies like ourselves, we are working in supply chains that are very extended. So it's not about working with my farms, let's say the farms that are supplying me, but those that are somehow connected. This is about resilience of the whole supply chain. So we call investors, we call partners exactly to make them see that is not only about one single area that is better than the others, but the importance is the full landscape should be better. So that's about resiliency and that's about our capacity to deliver food, biofuel for the future generations, not only this one, right? I would say that by getting the proper alignment, so expectations are well balanced. So we are talking about proper MRVs. So I will know better what, for instance, Walmart, who is in the room, would like to get in terms of outcomes and in terms of expectation. I can engage the farms better, right? By engaging the farms better, I also will be decreasing the risk of our operations, and that's so important for the financier perspective. I think that the major outcome is still resiliency and understanding where the risks are, mainly due to the depletion of natural resources and how ecosystem services could be playing a better role and they are not. So we have some trials and we have some other things that are clearly showing that the more that we invest in these terms, the better the yield is. So it's a win-win for everybody, for farmers, for end consumers, for investors, and for companies like ourselves. We have to scale this up. And scale this up means working collaboratively, working with others, and bring in the others that are not part of the solution yet, but they are definitely part of the positive outcome. So they have to be joining here today. Thanks so much. And I do apologize for not being able to stay any longer, but I think that our time is almost over anyway.
Yeah, thanks so thanks so much, Michelle. So yes, we are running short on time. So maybe a final question I have for start with Frederick is thinking about how, we've sort of heard there's a need to scale, there's a need to get more companies involved. At the same time, a lot of companies are involved, so maybe it's a balance of getting more companies involved and those that are involved to become more involved. But and at the same time, there's a lot of companies that are not involved in landscape initiatives and may not be thinking of this as a mechanism to address emerging and interconnected risks. So, Frederick, curious what you've heard, your thoughts, and from your experience, what might be the most effective ways to try to encourage more companies to be involved and or get more involved?
Um, well, to say the truth, when we first started talking, you mentioned these initiatives, and I hadn't really heard of them. And so I would argue maybe the main issue is although in your report you mentioned that there are already quite a number of companies that are involved with those, and I don't know if it's because in my conversations they were not mentioned or I didn't specifically ask for that. But I do ask on a regular basis to either retailers like Walmart, or wholesale companies or manufacturers, what their initiatives, what their nature-based initiatives are, to not only reduce emissions but also to mitigate the impact on nature and also to mitigate the potential risks. And not much has come in the form of these landscape initiatives. So I think probably the first thing, and hopefully this today's webinar contributes to that, is spread the knowledge. And certainly, as for myself, because I do regularly have conversations with companies in the food value chain. In my next conversations, I will mention those. I will specifically ask the question and see if companies do have that knowledge, and if they don't, I'll encourage them to look into this. I might even tell them that Sarah says a good report. I might even share it with them. So I think that's the first thing, because again, from the company point of view, if somebody comes along and says, "Hey, you're doing a really good job on trying to control what your supply chain is all about, and we know it's really costly. How about saving two-thirds of that cost?" What company is not going to be at least interested in that? So the cost efficiency. For me, also one thing that's important, but it might not necessarily be the case, is the collaborative activity. And as I said, I participate in Nature Action 100 groups, and I love exchanging with other investors. I think that's very fruitful, and also it helps spread the message. You can share experience, knowledge, best practices, and certainly in my NA 100 groups, when the topic comes up, I will mention this, and then hopefully I can contribute to spread the knowledge along. So yeah,
Yeah.
spread the word. I guess that's
Yeah.
the main thing.
So maybe just in the last minute or two, one final question, Simon, about this cost theme that has popped up a little bit. This is one of the areas where we don't have as much information or data, and it's sort of the business case that Karen presented at the top is, and we've heard it mentioned about efficiencies and scale in a way to be able to address future areas of sourcing as well. Anyway, in just a minute, you could sort of characterize the cost of some of these initiatives versus maybe the overall efforts for traceability monitoring. Is that the right way to be thinking about it, or is this just purely a complementary strategy to address, these more systemic risks? How to think about the cost piece of this?
Um, yeah, great question. The cost is a big component. I think we have to be really thoughtful about what we're solving for. There's a tremendous amount of effort around traceability, even probably larger effort around accounting with all of the different sort of climate and nature frameworks that exist. And there's just we like business faces trade-offs on that. If I have to sort of put dollars into accounting and traceability, like what ultimately is that delivering versus do we put money into direct impact? Um, I think like there's just trade-offs there. You can't do everything. And so there's going to be decisions on the margin. I think we have a strong preference towards impact. And so when I think about sort of like the different ways in which we could do, like we could invest a tremendous amount into palm oil along those raised, like so much money has been poured into palm oil traceability, and like there's been some progress made, but ultimately it's really still hard. It's an oil, it mixes, it blends, it's reconfigured. There's so many derivatives that are formed out. Like the the additional sort of utility of like that marginal gain around traceability is that, you have to sort of put that up against the next best use of those dollars. And I think there's a really strong case to be made. Is like it's probably more effective and will drive more impact to put that more into sort of that landscape kind of approach. But it just depends on what you're solving for there. I'd say like when we kind of look at some of the things, we actually have found some really interesting insights where actually like investing in like the best in class kind of landscape approach oftentimes has a cost that's lower than segregated or IP for certified. And so like that creates some really interesting sort of internal conversations and trade-offs. But cost is a factor. I think we have to overall get way more efficient. And then we have to really get sharp. When we say we're driving resilience, we have no way to quantify that. We, as like everybody who's working in the space. And I think we can do a much better job of kind of maybe flip that and think about resilience from the lens of reducing volatility for production and yield and outputs from these places. And how can we build that into the business case to sort of get more crowd more in and bring cost down. So I know we're out of time. Sorry. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, thanks so much, Simon. Great way to end. I think we unfortunately have run out of time. There are some big questions here where more work will be needed and conversations will continue to evolve. But really want to thank Frederick and Simon and Michelle for joining us. We should wrap up. We can put up our final slide. We have a participant survey. So maybe Rachel, if you could put that up for folks as we're continually looking to improve on the content we can bring forward and deliver. So there should be a QR code here with the participant survey. And so yeah, please take a minute to complete this if you can. And otherwise, I'd like to thank everyone again and look forward to continuing these important conversations. So thanks, everyone.
Thank you very much.